On the morning of September 14, 2003, the Merrimack River came up 17 feet in 9 hours. It had been raining since Thursday, not the dramatic thunderstorm kind of rain that people see coming and prepare for, the quiet kind, the steady, gray, relentless kind that falls at 2 inches per hour and keeps falling until the ground has no more room for it and the water has nowhere to go except where it goes when every other option is gone, which is downstream, fast, and carrying everything it can lift. By Sunday morning, every low road in Crawford County, Missouri was underwater. The county highway department had its 6 trucks out all night. 3 were stuck before dawn. The radio said to stay home. The sky said the same thing in a language older than radio. And the only bridge connecting the 12 farms on the west side of Hatchet Creek to Route W, the paved road, the school road, the road to the hospital in Sullivan, was buried under 4 feet of moving water and 600 tons of debris, logs, fence posts, a section of dock from somewhere upstream, a propane tank, corn stalks, a piece of aluminum shed roofing that had wrapped itself around the bridge railing like a flag, a full-grown cottonwood tree, root ball and all, wedged against the upstream face of the bridge deck and holding everything else in place the way a keystone holds an arch. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The bridge itself was intact. That was the thing. The concrete and steel structure, built in 1971, was fine, sound, not going anywhere. But the debris load against it was so complete, so packed and interlocked, that the road surface was invisible, and the approach roads on both sides were buried under 3 feet of packed silt, gravel, and flood trash that the receding water had deposited like a slow-motion avalanche. By Sunday afternoon, the water had dropped. By Sunday evening, you could see the bridge railing. By Monday morning, you could see the road surface, but you couldn't drive on it. Not a car, not a truck, not a school bus, not an ambulance. The debris field covered 200 yards of road on the east approach alone. Packed silt 2 feet deep in some places, interlocked logs and branches in others, the cottonwood root ball still blocking the upstream face of the bridge deck. Monday morning, 12 farms. 1 way in and 1 way out. The county highway department assessed it Monday at 9 a.m. The supervisor, a man named Keith Oswald, drove out in his department pickup and stood at the edge of the debris field and looked at it for a long time. He was 51 years old. He had been with the department for 23 years. He had seen flood damage before, but he had not seen this. Not this specific combination of volume and interlocking. The cottonwood was the problem. Everything else was debris. The cottonwood was architecture. Its root ball, 8 feet across, was wedged against the upstream railing, and the debris had packed against it, and against everything else, into a single mass that was not moving on its own. Keith called his department at 9:30. He had 3 usable machines at that point: a backhoe that was operational, a dump truck, and a road grader. The grader was for the approach roads, the silt and gravel deposits. The backhoe was for the logs. The dump truck was for hauling. He also had a problem. The backhoe couldn't reach the cottonwood from the approach. The root ball was against the bridge railing, which meant you needed to come at it from the bridge deck itself. The bridge deck was the only clear surface, but the county's backhoe was a Case 580, a rear hoe machine that worked off the back of a tractor frame. To get the arm over the railing and down to the root ball, you'd need to drive the machine onto the bridge, set the stabilizers, and reach over. The Case 580 weighed 17,000 pounds. The bridge was rated for 40,000. That was fine. The problem was the approach. The east approach was 2 feet of packed silt and debris before you reached the bridge deck. If the backhoe tried to drive through that, it would sink. 17,000 pounds on 2 feet of waterlogged silt is not an approach. It is a burial. Keith called the state highway department. They had a crane truck, a larger machine that could reach the cottonwood from the road without going onto the bridge. The crane truck was in Rolla. Rolla was 2 hours away. The crane truck was committed to a state highway closure in Phelps County that was higher priority. Earliest availability, Wednesday. Keith called the county judge. In Missouri, the county judge is the county's chief executive and reported the situation. Bridge approach blocked. 12 farms isolated. Earliest repair estimate, 48 hours, pending crane truck availability. The county judge said, "What do the families need?" Keith said, "They need the road open." The county judge said, "When?" Keith said, "Wednesday." That call went out at 10:15 Monday morning. By 10:30, it had reached most of the 12 farms the way information reaches rural communities, which is through phones and neighbors and the specific efficiency of people who know each other and know what matters. One of those calls reached a man named Harlan Brock. Harlan Brock was 68 years old and had farmed 220 acres on the west side of Hatchet Creek since 1971, the same year they built the bridge he was now cut off from. He'd watched them pour that concrete from his side of the creek. He'd been the first one across it when they opened it. He remembered thinking as he drove across it in his pickup that first time that a county bridge was the kind of thing that meant a farm was real, connected, part of the world on the other side of the water. He had 2 machines in his equipment shed that nobody else on the west side of Hatchet Creek had. One of them was a 1953 Farmall Super M that he used for light work around the farm. The other was a 1938 Adams Road grader that his father had bought used in 1959 for $200 from the Phelps County Road Department when they replaced their fleet. The Adams was not a tractor. It was not a tractor with an attachment. It was a dedicated road grading machine, designed and built for one purpose: moving material off road surfaces and into ditches, or out of ditches and back onto road surfaces, with precision and control that no tractor-mounted blade could match. It was 82 inches of moldboard steel on a frame that weighed 11,000 pounds. The moldboard, the curved blade that did the actual work, was adjustable in every dimension: angle, tilt, side shift, height. A skilled operator could set it to cut a precise crown into a road surface, or to windrow material to one side, or to feather gravel into a smooth grade, or to scarify packed material loose before regrading it. The Adams had a gasoline engine that Harlan's father had replaced in 1963 with a diesel conversion. The diesel was a 4-cylinder Perkins that Harlan had rebuilt twice and understood at the molecular level. He knew every sound it made when it was right and every sound it made when it was wrong. He could tell you the compression on each cylinder from memory. The machine moved at 4 miles per hour in working gear. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. It was the mechanical equivalent of a man who does one thing and does it completely. Harlan had used it to maintain his own farm lanes for 40 years. He had graded his half-mile entrance lane every spring after the frost heave and every fall before the mud. He had loaned it twice to neighbors whose lanes had washed. He had used it once, in 1987, to help the county clear a road slide on the south end of his road when the county's own grader was broken down. The county grader operator, a man named Dennis, had watched Harlan work the Adams for 2 hours that day and then said, "You operate that thing better than I operate ours." Harlan had said, "I've been operating this one machine for 30 years. You operate 6 different machines and 200 miles of road. I'd expect myself to be better at this one." Dennis had thought about that and said, "That's fair." When the call came at 10:30 Monday morning telling Harlan the road was blocked and Wednesday was the earliest estimate, Harlan said, "I'll call you back in 20 minutes. He hung up and walked to his equipment shed. He looked at Adams. Adams looked back the way old machines look back when they have been cared for and know it. He walked to the door of the shed and looked east, toward the bridge he couldn't see but could find blindfolded, down the lane and across the creek and up the road that was now buried under 2 feet of flood debris. He walked back to the phone and called his neighbor Frank Settle, who farmed 160 acres on the south end of the west side. He said, "Frank, I'm going to take the Adams down to the bridge approach. I think I can clear the debris field and open the road. I need you to come with me in case I need someone on the ground." Frank said, "When?" Harlan said, "Now." Frank said, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Before we talk about what happened at the bridge, let me tell you about the Adams number. 10 motor grader, because the machine is the reason this story ends the way it ends, and understanding the machine means understanding what Harlan was about to attempt. The Adams Road Grader Company of Algona, Iowa, built motor graders from 1920 until they were acquired in 1928 by a larger manufacturer. The machines they built in that period were, by the standards of their era, among the finest road-working equipment available. The number 10, introduced in 1926, was their flagship model. It weighed 11,000 pounds empty. The moldboard was 82 inches wide with a 24-inch height, curved to the standard road grading radius that had been established by highway engineers in the 1910s and hasn't changed since. The key feature of the Adams number 10, the feature that made it worth keeping when newer machines were available, was its blade control system. The moldboard was controlled by a system of mechanical levers and worm gears that allowed the operator to adjust angle, tilt, and side shift independently from the seat without stopping the machine. It was not hydraulic. There were no hydraulic cylinders on the 1938 Adams. Everything was mechanical, gears and levers, designed to be operated by hand with the sensitivity and precision that only mechanical linkage allows. Hydraulics are powerful. Mechanical linkage is precise. The difference matters when you're grading around a problem rather than through it. A modern hydraulic grader can push a larger volume of material faster than the Adams could, but the Adams could feel the material in a way that a hydraulic machine cannot. When the blade encountered a change in resistance, a buried log, a shift from silt to gravel, a transition from packed to loose material, the mechanical feedback traveled up through the levers to the operator's hands. Harlan could feel what the blade was encountering before he could see it. He had been feeling it for 40 years. He'd also modified the machine in one significant way in 1989, after the 1987 road slide. He'd added a rear scarifier, a set of steel teeth on a hinged frame behind the moldboard that could be dropped into the road surface to break up packed material before the blade passed over it. He'd fabricated the scarifier himself from half-inch plate steel and 3-inch round bar, welded to a bracket that mounted on the Adams rear frame. It was not a factory part. It was not in any Adams manual. It was a solution to a specific problem that Harlan had identified: packed, waterlogged material that a blade alone would ride over instead of cutting into, and he had built the solution the way farmers build solutions, from what was available and what was needed. He started the Adams at 11 Monday morning. The diesel caught on the second pull of the decompression lever, settled into the idle that Harlan had set for field work, not road work, and he let it warm for 4 minutes. He checked the blade linkages. He checked the scarifier mounting. He checked the tire pressures. The Adams ran on pneumatic tires on the rear axle and solid rubber on the front. And he checked the fuel level, which was 3/4 full. He drove out of the shed at 11:15. Frank Settle was waiting in the lane in his truck. Harlan drove the Adams down his half-mile lane at 4 miles per hour and turned east on the county road toward the bridge. The road itself was muddy but passable. The flooding had covered this stretch but not deeply, and the drainage had been adequate. The surface was soft but firm enough for the Adams' 11,000 pounds. He reached the east edge of the debris field at 11:30. He stopped the machine and got out and walked into the debris field on foot, the way a man walks into unfamiliar ground, carefully and attentively. Frank walked with him. They were looking for two things: the depth profile. Where was the material deepest and where was it shallowing? And the structure of the interlocking. Where were the logs that were holding everything else in place? The debris field was approximately 200 yards long on the east approach. The material varied. At the far end, closest to the bridge, the depth was greatest, 18 to 24 inches of packed silt and gravel, with logs interlocked on top. In the middle section, the depth was 12 to 16 inches, mostly silt with scattered branches and fence material. At the near end, the material was 6 to 8 inches, primarily silt and fine gravel. The cottonwood was a separate problem. It was against the bridge railing on the upstream side, and its root ball was holding a secondary debris field directly against the upstream face of the bridge deck. Harlan looked at it for a long time, He walked down to the creek bank and looked at it from the side. He could not reach the root ball with Adams from the approach. The angle was wrong and the bank was too steep, but he could reach the debris that the root ball was holding. If he could clear the debris from the downstream side of the bridge deck, the material that had piled up behind the initial blockage, he could reduce the pressure against the root ball and potentially allow the creek's current to do the final work of moving the cottonwood. The creek was still running fast enough that a root ball freed from its pinned position might move on its own. Harlan walked back to Adams and stood beside it for a moment. Frank said, "What are you thinking?" Harlan said, "I'm thinking we work from this end toward the bridge. Clear the approach first, then the deck surface, then deal with the cottonwood last and let the creek help." Frank said, "The county said Wednesday." Harlan said, "The county's waiting for a crane. I'm not waiting for a crane." He climbed back onto the Adams at 11:45. He engaged the scarifier first. The steel teeth dropped into the near end of the debris field and broke the surface as the Adams moved forward. The silt at the near end was waterlogged but not densely compacted. The scarifier broke it into workable sections. The blade followed, set at a 20-degree angle to windrow the material to the right side of the road, the downstream side, away from the creek. He made the first pass at 4 miles per hour. 200 yards took about 3 minutes per pass. The blade caught the scarified material and rolled it to the right, building a windrow against the road shoulder that grew with each pass. Silt, gravel, debris, all of it moving to the right and off the road's surface. The first 3 passes cleared the near end, the light material, down to bare road surface. The gravel was back in the windrow. The silt was in the ditch. The road was visible and passable for the first 60 yards from Harlan's end. Then he reached the middle section, the 12 to 16-inch material. This was where the logs started. A farm road grader does not move logs. It moves soil and gravel. But the logs in the middle section were not large, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, fence post-sized material, and they were embedded in silt rather than lying on a hard surface. Harlan changed his approach. He raised the blade slightly, set the scarifier to maximum depth, and slowed to 3 miles per hour. The scarifier broke around the embedded logs, loosening the silt around them. Then Harlan lowered the blade and made a shallow cut, 2 inches rather than 6, that caught the silt and undercut the logs. The logs, loosened from below, rolled with the blade instead of blocking it. Not all of them. Some required Frank to move them by hand, stepping into the debris field with gloves and a pry bar to free a log that had caught an angle the blade couldn't handle. Frank worked alongside Adams, ahead of the blade, clearing what needed clearing. Harlan kept the machine moving. This section took longer. Each 30-yard segment required 2 or 3 passes and periodic handwork from Frank. But it moved. The road surface appeared. The windrow on the right grew. By 1:30 they had cleared 130 of the 200 yards. The last 70 yards, the section closest to the bridge, was the heaviest. The silt was 20 to 24 inches deep. The logs were larger, mixed with sections of fence that had wrapped and tangled. The debris was interlocked in the way that flood deposits interlock when the water drops fast and leaves everything where it was traveling. Harlan stopped and ate a sandwich from his jacket pocket. He drank water from a thermos. Frank did the same. They looked at the last 70 yards and the bridge beyond it and the cottonwood root ball visible above the railing on the upstream side. Frank said, "That's the hard part." Harlan said, "That's always the hard part. The beginning is easy and the end is hard. That's how work is." He started the Adams again at 1:45. The last 70 yards took 2 hours. Harlan dropped the blade to maximum depth, 4 inches, and slowed to 2 miles per hour. The scarifier worked ahead of the blade at maximum penetration. The combined action broke the packed silt from below, while the blade cut from the top, creating a shearing action that moved the material rather than pushing it. The larger logs required a different technique. Harlan angled the blade to 45 degrees, a steep angle that pushed material strongly to one side, and made short passes, 20 yards at a time, building enough momentum in the windrow that the logs rolled with the silt rather than stopping it. 3 of the logs were too large and too tangled to move with the blade. Frank worked those with the pry bar, while Harlan kept the blade on the surrounding material, reducing the support around the tangled sections until Frank could lever them free. The fence sections were the most time-consuming. Wire mesh and barbed wire, wrapped around logs and buried in silt, does not move with the blade. It catches on the blade edge and requires cutting. Frank carried bolt cutters. He cut every section of wire he encountered before the blade reached it, working 10 yards ahead of Adams, identifying and cutting wire while Harlan worked the material behind him. This was the rhythm they found. Frank 10 yards ahead, bolt cutters in hand, cutting wire and marking large obstructions. Harlan on the Adams, blade working the cleared material, pausing when Frank raised his hand, waiting while Frank cleared the obstacle, then moving again. At 3:15, Adams reached the bridge deck. The deck surface itself was under 4 inches of silt and fine gravel. Clean work for the blade. Harlan made 2 passes across the bridge deck. The blade set shallow and angled to windrow to the right. The concrete appeared. The center line appeared. The expansion joints appeared. The bridge was a bridge again. The cottonwood was still against the upstream railing. Harlan looked at it from the bridge deck. What he saw was different from what he'd seen from the bank. From the bridge deck, he could see that the root ball was not wedged as firmly as he'd thought. The flood debris that had been holding it in place, pressing it against the railing from the downstream side, was gone. He had moved it. 200 yards of debris cleared and windrowed to the road shoulder. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Without the pressure from the downstream debris, the root ball was resting against the railing under its own weight, held in place by friction and the current pressing it from upstream. Harlan thought about this. He got off the Adams and stood at the upstream railing and looked at the root ball and the current and the angle. The creek was moving at perhaps 6 miles per hour. The root ball was 8 feet across, 3 feet above the waterline, held against the railing by the weight of the tree and the friction of bark on concrete. He called Frank over. He said, "If we can break the friction hold, get the root ball moving, the current will take it." Frank said, "How do you break the friction hold?" Harlan said, "Come back to the Adams with me." He drove the Adams to the upstream edge of the bridge deck, on the opposite railing from the cottonwood. He angled the blade to maximum reach, 30 degrees past center, the blade extending past the machine's center line toward the upstream railing. He lowered the blade to a railing height. What he was proposing was not in any road grader manual. He was going to use the Adams moldboard as a lever, a broad, curved steel surface, to push against the side of the root ball and break the static friction that was holding it against the railing. Not a heavy push, not a ram. A steady, controlled pressure from a curved steel blade against a curved root ball surface, enough to set it moving. Once moving, the current would do the rest. Frank stood back from the railing. Harlan engaged the working gear, moved the Adams forward at 1 mile per hour, and let the blade face contact with the root ball. He felt the contact through the levers. The mechanical linkage transmitted the resistance of 8 feet of root ball to his hands. He applied steady pressure, not more, not less. For 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then it moved. The root ball shifted, a quarter turn clockwise in the water. The friction broke. The current caught the root end of the tree, which was downstream and in the water, and the whole cottonwood began to rotate, slowly at first and then faster, the root ball pulling away from the railing and into the current and the tree following it, the whole thing swinging downstream like a clock hand. Harlan backed the Adams off the railing. The cottonwood moved downstream at the speed of the current, 7 or 8 miles per hour, out of sight around the creek bend in less than a minute. The bridge railing was clear. Harlan drove the Adams off the bridge and shut the engine down. He got off the machine and stood on the East Approach Road, which was clear and passable. He looked at the bridge, which was clear and passable. He looked at the road behind him, 200 yards of cleared and windrowed debris, the windrow sitting neatly on the right shoulder. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. He had started at 11:45, 6 hours and 45 minutes. Frank came and stood beside him. They looked at the bridge without saying anything. Then Frank said, "You want to drive across it?" Harlan said, "It's a bridge. That's what you do with a bridge." He got back on the Adams and drove it across to the west side. Then he drove it back. Then he drove his truck across. Frank had gone back for the truck while Harlan made his final passes on the bridge deck. 32,000 pounds of loaded pickup and trailer. The bridge held everything it had always held. At 3:45, Harlan called Keith Oswald at the County Highway Department. He said, "Keith, it's Harlan Brock. The east approach is clear. The bridge deck is clear. The road is passable." Silence on Keith's end for a moment. Then Keith said, "What?" Harlan said, "The debris field. I cleared it with my Adams. About 6 hours of work. The road is open." Keith said, "Harlan, we weren't going to get there until Wednesday." Harlan said, "I know. My neighbors needed it open Monday." Keith said, "I'm going to come look at this." Harlan said, "Come when you want. I'll be home." He drove the Adams back to his farm, parked it in the shed, cleaned the blade, and went inside for dinner. Keith Oswald arrived at the bridge at 4:30 with his assistant supervisor, a woman named Diane who had been with the department for 11 years and had seen most things that flood season could produce. She had not seen this. They stood at the edge of the cleared approach road and looked at 200 yards of clean, passable road surface. The windrow was tight on the right shoulder. The silt line was visible on the road edge, showing where the debris had been. The bridge deck was clean, concrete visible, center line visible, both railings intact. Keith walked the approach slowly, the way a roadman walks a road he is reading. He looked at the crown, the natural drainage shape of the road surface. It was intact. Harlan had not just cleared the debris, he had restored the original crown as he worked, the blade set to follow the road's existing grade rather than create a flat surface. Diane crouched at the edge of the windrow and looked at the cross-section of the pile, silt on the bottom, gravel above it, logs and larger material on top. The windrow was stratified, laid in the order the material had been encountered, which told her something about the technique used: shallow first, building to deep, material sorted as it was placed. She said, "He worked this section by section." Keith said, "That's what he told me." She said, "This is a grader job, a proper grader job, not a backhoe scrape." Keith said, "He's got a 1938 Adams, his father's machine." Diane looked at the windrow. She looked at the road surface. She looked at the bridge. She said, "That machine is 65 years old." Keith said, "And it did what our equipment couldn't do today." She said, "Our equipment wasn't here." Keith said, "Our equipment wouldn't have been here until Wednesday. His equipment was here today." They drove across the bridge, both of them, Keith in the county truck, Diane following in her vehicle, 32,000 pounds combined. The bridge handled it the way it had handled everything since 1971. Keith called the county judge from the bridge. He said, "The bridge approach is open." Harlan Brock cleared it with his road grader. The county judge said, "Harlan Brock." Keith said, 200 yards of flood debris. 6 hours, a 1938 motor grader. The county judge said, "When?" Keith said, "He finished at 3:30. The county judge was quiet for a moment. He said, "I told 12 families they'd be in until Wednesday." Keith said, "They were in until 3:30 Monday." Keith drove to Harlan's farm the following morning. Harlan was in the shed, doing the Adams post-work maintenance. He greased the blade linkages, checked the scarifier mounting, cleaned the silt from around the rear axle, the machine care that follows every job and that keeps an 80-year-old machine functional. Keith stood in the shed doorway. Harlan said, Keith said, "I want to see the machine." Harlan stepped back and Keith walked up to the Adams. He ran his hand along the moldboard face, still clay-colored from the silt. the curve of the 1938 steel smooth under his palm. He looked at the scarifier, the homemade attachment welded to the rear frame. He looked at the mechanical blade controls, the levers and worm gears that had been transmitting road feel to Harlan's hands since 1959. He said, "This is what cleared the approach." Harlan said, "This," and Frank settled with a pair of bolt cutters. Keith said, "Our plan was a crane truck and a backhoe and 2 days." Harlan said, "My plan was a grader and a neighbor and 1 afternoon." Keith looked at the machine. He said, "How did you know you could move the cottonwood?" Harlan said, "I didn't know it for certain. I knew the debris behind it was what was pinning it. Once I cleared the debris, I thought there was a chance the current would take it if I could break the static friction. The Adams has a moldboard face. A moldboard face is a lever. I used it as a lever." Keith said, "That's not in any road maintenance manual." Harlan said, "No. It's in 30 years of operating this machine and knowing what it can do." Keith said, "What do you want for it?" "For the work." Harlan said, "Nothing." Keith said, "Harlan." Harlan said, "My neighbors needed the road open. I opened it. There's nothing to pay for." Keith said, "The county should compensate." Harlan said, "Keith, I used 12 gallons of diesel. At current prices, that's about $22. I'll count the fuel as my contribution to the county road system." Keith looked at him. He was 68 years old. He had cleared 200 yards of flood debris with a machine that was older than most of the people in the county highway department. He had done it alone except for a neighbor with bolt cutters. He had done it in 6 hours instead of 48, and he was declining payment. Keith said, "At minimum, let us handle the windrow. Our grader can push that material into the ditch properly. Clean up your work." Harlan said, "That I'll accept." The county grader came out Tuesday afternoon and worked the windrow into the ditch, smoothing the road shoulder and clearing the debris from the drain line. The operator, a man named Terry who had been with the department for 8 years, spent 2 hours finishing what Harlan had started. Terry drove past the Adams in the equipment shed on his way out. He slowed the county grader and looked at it through the cab window. The Adams number 10, 1938, 65 years old, sitting in a shed on a farm in Crawford County, Missouri, cleaner and better maintained than some equipment half its age. Terry stopped the county grader and got out and stood looking at the Adams for a moment. He'd been operating graders his whole career. He knew what a grader was and what it could do. He looked at the moldboard, the blade controls, the scarifier on the back. He said to Harlan, who had come out to the shed, "Did you really clear that approach in 6 hours?" Harlan said, 6 hours 45 minutes. Terry said, "With this machine." Harlan said, "With this machine." Terry walked around the Adams slowly. He stopped at the blade controls and put his hands on the levers. The mechanical linkage was immediately different from the hydraulic controls in the county grader. There was resistance in the levers, weight, a tactile quality that hydraulic controls don't have. He said, "These controls are mechanical." Harlan said, "All mechanical, no hydraulics." Terry said, "You can feel what the blade is doing." Harlan said, "That's the point. You can feel every change in material resistance, every transition. You know what's under the blade before you see it." Terry looked at the Adams for another moment. Then he looked at Harlan. He said, "Our county grader is a 2001 John Deere, fully hydraulic, GPS grade control, automated blade positioning. It cost $210,000. Harlan said, "The Adams cost my father $200 in 1959. Terry said, "And you cleared the approach in 6 hours. Harlan said, "The machine knows what it's doing. I've just been listening to it for 40 years. Terry drove the county grader back to the department lot. He told the story at the shop that afternoon. He told it the way people tell stories about equipment they have seen do something unexpected, precisely and with the specific respect that competence earns when you see it operate in your own field. Keith heard it. Diane heard it. The county judge heard it. By the end of the week, most of Crawford County had heard it. There is a quality that old machines have when they have been maintained by people who understand them that newer machines do not have. Not better, exactly. Different in a way that matters. A new machine is built to specification. It does what it was designed to do within the parameters it was designed for. It has sensors and controls and automation that make the operator's job easier and the output more consistent. It is a remarkable thing, a modern machine, and the people who build them know things about materials and engineering that the builders of the 1938 Adams did not know. But a new machine does not have 40 years of one operator's understanding built into it. It does not have the specific modifications that a specific man made to solve specific problems on specific roads in specific seasons. It does not have the mechanical feedback that tells an experienced hand what is happening at the blade edge 8 feet ahead of the operator's position. Adams had all of that. Harlan had given it all of that. 40 years of grading, maintenance, modification, and attention had made the machine and the man into a single system that understood one kind of work completely. The county's equipment was more capable in absolute terms, more powerful, faster, able to move larger volumes of material in a shorter time with less physical effort from the operator. But it was not available Monday morning. It was in Phelps County or stuck in mud or committed to higher priority work. The capacity that was not present was not useful. Adams was present. The man who knew how to use it was present. The neighbor with the bolt cutters was present. And the road was open by 3:30 Monday afternoon instead of Wednesday evening. That is the whole calculation. Keith Oswald retired from the Crawford County Highway Department in 2009. He told the story of Harlan Brock and the Adams road grader at his retirement dinner, which was held at the VFW Hall in Steelville and attended by most of the people he'd worked with over 28 years. He told it the way roadmen tell stories about work, with precise attention to the numbers and the sequence and the specific problems that had to be solved. He told it without embellishment because the story doesn't need embellishment. The facts are enough. 200 yards of flood debris, 6 hours and 45 minutes, a 1938 motor grader, a neighbor with bolt cutters, $22 in diesel versus Wednesday, a crane truck from Rolla, 2 days, 12 farms waiting. Keith said at the dinner, "In 28 years of road work, I have never seen a better example of the difference between capacity and presence. We had the capacity, we didn't have the presence. Harlan had the presence, and he had a 65-year-old machine that he understood better than I understand any machine I've ever operated. That's not something the county budget can buy. That's something a man builds over 40 years of paying attention to one piece of equipment on one road in one county." He paused. He said, "We have the best equipment money can buy. Harlan has the best operator money can't buy." On that Monday morning, his equipment won. Not because it was better, because it was there, and he was ready, and he didn't wait for Wednesday. The Adams number 10 is still in Harlan's shed. Harlan's son Dale farms the 220 acres now. Dale uses the Adams the way his father used it, to maintain the half-mile entrance lane, to help neighbors after flood events, to do the work that a dedicated road grader does better than any other machine when the operator knows the machine and knows the road. Dale is 44. He has been operating the Adams since he was 17. 27 years on one machine. He is building the specific knowledge that accumulates only through time and repetition, and the patient attention that his father demonstrated, and that the Adams rewards with mechanical feedback that no electronic sensor can replicate. The bridge on Hatchet Creek, the 1971 concrete and steel structure, was replaced in 2018 with a wider, higher clearance span rated for heavier loads. The new bridge is better in every technical specification. It clears the flood line by 6 feet instead of 4. It handles larger vehicles. When the county engineer presented the new bridge design at the public meeting, he noted that the 2003 flood event had demonstrated the need for improved approach road drainage and a higher bridge profile. The old bridge had survived the flood intact, but the approach had been vulnerable to debris deposition. He did not mention the 1938 Adams road grader. He did not mention Harlan Brock or Frank Settle or the 6 hours and 45 minutes or the $22 in diesel. But Keith Oswald was in the back of the room, and after the presentation he raised his hand and said, "The reason we could afford the new bridge is partly because the county didn't spend $40,000 on emergency repairs in 2003. A farmer named Harlan Brock cleared the approach with a 65-year-old road grader 6 hours after the flood receded. That equipment is still on his farm. That knowledge is still in his family. I'd like the record to reflect that. The room was quiet. The county engineer said, "That will be noted in the minutes." It was noted in the minutes. Page 7 of the Crawford County Commission meeting record for April 14, 2018. The minutes do not do justice to Adams. Minutes rarely do justice to old machines. But somewhere in the official record of Crawford County, Missouri, there is a line that says a 1938 road grader cleared a flood-damaged bridge approach in 6 hours, and a farmer named Harlan Brock did it because his neighbors needed the road open and Wednesday was too long to wait. That is the whole story. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.